Morning, church. I pray that this past weekend was a great one, but now, as we begin a brand new week, I pray that we can focus on Jesus and find peace, comfort, hope, reassurance, whatever it may be that you're looking for. I pray that we can find it in Him. With that, let's begin. Now, most of my friends and people that know me would probably say that I'm a pretty indecisive person. Especially when it comes to like food. Anything food related, I definitely am pretty indecisive. When people ask me like, oh, where do you want to eat? Or what do you want to eat? I usually can't make a decision. When I go grocery shopping, right? There's so many different kinds of the same thing, right? So many different options, right? Different types of bread, different types of meats, different types of butters, yogurts, milk, different kinds of toilet paper, right? Different air fresheners, different cleaning products. There's so many different types and varieties and kinds of the same thing. And it gets really challenging to choose out of the midst of all of those different things. But in any of these kinds of situation where you're presented with many options and you're kind of stuck trying to decide, I always think of these questions, right? It's like, which is the right one? Which is the best one? Which is the one that is for me? Okay. Now, I think a lot of the times we want to make the right decision. I don't really know too many people that don't want to make the right decision, but I think a lot of us want to make the right decision. Now, for some people, making these decisions are quite easy. For both decisive and indecisive people, I think there's one question that we all run into and we struggle with. And the question is, what is God's will for my life? Now, I promise you, you're probably thinking about this and wondering, what is God's will for my life? Or maybe you've been in that position before and you know the feeling and remember how hard it was to try and figure out what God's will is for our life. Now, regardless of your experience, your preference, regardless of the environment, regardless of all of these things, there are many different options, so to say, that we have to decide to try and figure out which one is God's will for you and me, right? What does God want from me? Where is God leading? What am I supposed to do so that I can live a life that aligns with God? Now, I don't think anyone can tell you what God's will is for your life, right? That's between you and God. So today, I'm not going to tell you what that looks like. But what I want to show you today is that there is an answer in the Bible that becomes the starting point of figuring out what God's will is for your life and what that may look like. We wrap up the book of First Thessalonians, his first letter, Paul's first letter to this church. In chapter 5, he begins by talking about an issue where people are worried about when is Jesus going to come, the second coming, and Paul is just saying, hey, just be ready, encourage one another, don't scare one another about this end time stuff. Just worry about being ready and hold on to the hope together that he will come back for us. And this problem happens again later in this church, but we'll talk about that later this week. And then after Paul talks about that, Paul gives final instructions to the church. And you may have heard it before. 1 Thessalonians 5:16 to 18, and it says, "Rejoice always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." You see, if you want to know what God's will is for your life, it begins with learning to rejoice always, learning to pray continually, and learning to give thanks in all circumstances. So, the big question, what do these mean? Okay, to rejoice always doesn't mean that you have to always be happy. It doesn't mean you have to hide your sadness or your struggles from people. That's really not realistic. And think about it. Even Jesus, he experienced moments of sadness. He wept, right? And he even struggled when he was praying to God and asking God to take the cup away from him, right? Now, it's easy for us when things don't go as planned or they're not going well, that we just try to stay sad or stay in the moment of darkness. And sometimes we end up focusing way too much on this and it destroys us. But you see, what Paul is doing, and by telling us to rejoice always, is he's trying to change our focus. So you see, to rejoice always is an attitude of hope and happiness that comes from changing our focus from the bad to Jesus. If you look at a lot of the Psalms, right, King David, he talks about the sadness and he's crying and he's lamenting, but then at the end of each Psalm, the situation may stay the same, sadness, crying, lamenting, but now he's focused on how great God is and how wonderful God is. To pray without ceasing or to pray continuously, it doesn't mean you have to always be on your eyes closed and hands folded on your knees, right? That would be a problem, right? Driving, eating, going to school, like you wouldn't be able to do those things. Now it's interesting because this word, this kind of to pray without ceasing or pray continuously, it's kind of this ideal of a bad cough, right? You don't cough like nonstop. It's an often and repeated process that goes over and over, right? I'm coughing all day long. So in the same way, to pray continuously means to be frequent and persistent in our communication with God. And this includes, getting on our knees and praying, but it also includes keeping God on your mind and dwelling with Him and walking with Him. And finally, when Paul says to give thanks in all circumstances, that means to give thanks to God in all circumstances. And that's not easy, especially when things don't go the way we want, or when things go south, or when things are undesirable. You see, it's not easy to be thankful when we don't feel thankful. But remember, you can still give God thanks even if you don't feel thankful. And see, when we make this difficult and challenging decision, when we give God thanks regardless of the circumstances and despite how we might feel, we're allowing ourselves to align with God's will for us. You see, all of these three things is the starting place for seeing what God's will may look like in your life. And all of these three things, they take time. It takes energy. It takes practice. These things just don't happen overnight. So every day, every moment that we have, let's make the decision to do our best to follow these three steps. I leave you with this prayer. God, give me the motivation to rejoice always, to pray continually, and give thanks to you in all circumstances. Help me better understand your will for my life.